The coin hit the counter with a sound like a gunshot, and every head in Caldwell's general store turned toward it. Della Wilcox stood at the front of the line with her back perfectly straight and her chin lifted at an angle that defied every humiliating thing happening inside her chest. The single coin she had placed on the worn wooden counter was her last, not her second to last, not the remainder of a thin purse, her absolute last coin, and it was not enough. It was not even close to enough. The total that old Gerald Caldwell had scratched onto his paper with his stubby pencil amounted to $1.42, and what Della had placed before him was a single Liberty-seated dime. 10 cents. The difference between those two numbers was not just a financial gap, it was a chasm, and it yawned open beneath her feet like the earth itself was trying to swallow her whole. Gerald Caldwell looked at the dime. He looked at Della. He looked at the small pile of goods she had selected with such careful, agonizing deliberation over the past 20 minutes. Things she needed, not things she wanted, flour and salt, and a small paper twist of baking soda. And he scratched the back of his neck in a way that told her he was building himself up to say something that would embarrass them both. There were 5 people behind her in line. Mrs. Helena Pratt, who ran the millinery and whose tongue moved faster than any telegraph wire in the Arizona Territory. 2 ranch hands from the double bar outfit who smelled of cattle and would remember everything that happened in town for the purposes of Saturday night storytelling. A young woman Della did not recognize who was probably just passing through on the eastbound stage. And the last person in line, standing near the door with a box of supplies tucked under one arm, and an expression so carefully neutral it was almost painful to look at, was Sheriff Elijah Ellsworth. He was watching her. Not with pity, because she would have recognized that and burned the whole store down before she accepted it. He was watching with that quiet, calculating attention he brought to everything, the kind that made men in this town confess things they had been holding for years, and made women feel inexplicably seen in ways they had not signed up for. Gerald Caldwell opened his mouth. And before he could say a word, before he could produce that awful apologetic grimace and tell Della that her credit was not good here anymore, which it was not, she knew that, before any of it could happen, she heard boot steps behind her. Unhurried, measured boot steps that belonged to someone who never moved through the world with urgency because they had never needed to. And then a large, sun-browned hand reached past her and it placed exact change on the counter without a single word. $1.32 in coins, counted out already. The hand withdrew. The boot steps moved back. Gerald Caldwell blinked. He swept the coins into his palm, counted them, nodded once and began wrapping Della's flour and salt in brown paper. Nobody said anything. Nobody explained anything. Della stood very still, and the blood in her body could not decide whether to rush to her face or drain away entirely, and for one burning second she thought she might faint, which was something she had never done in her 26 years on this earth and was not prepared to begin doing now. She turned around slowly. Elijah Ellsworth was already looking elsewhere. He was studying the shelf of tobacco tins with the focused interest of a man who had apparently developed a passionate late-in-life devotion to the subject of cured tobacco leaves. The star pinned to his vest caught the afternoon light coming through the store's single large window. His jaw was set. His dark hair was pushed back from his face by the brim of the hat he held loosely at his side. He was 32 years old and had been sheriff of the town of Harlow, Arizona Territory, for 6 of those years, and in all of that time, Della Wilcox had never once asked him for anything. She picked up her wrapped parcels from the counter. She walked past him toward the door. And because she was Della Wilcox, because she had survived things that would have destroyed other people, she kept her head up and her shoulders level until she stepped out into the fierce white light of the Arizona afternoon, and the door swung shut behind her, and she was alone on the boardwalk with her parcels clutched against her chest and her eyes stinging in a way that had nothing to do with the sun. She had been hiding it for 8 months. 8 months of increasingly desperate arithmetic, of meals stretched thinner and thinner, of telling herself that things would turn around, that the work would come back, that the land her father had left her would somehow begin producing what it had promised. 8 months of performing financial stability for a town that would have eaten her alive otherwise, because that was what Harlow did to women alone. The moment they smelled weakness, the circling began. She had thought she was so careful. She had thought nobody knew. And then there was Sheriff Elijah Ellsworth, who apparently knew everything, and who had chosen to do something about it with as little fanfare as possible, which somehow made it 10 times worse and 10 times more devastating all at the same time. She pressed her back against the exterior wall of Caldwell's and tipped her head back and breathed. She needed to think about how she had ended up here. Not on this boardwalk specifically, but here, in this situation, in this story, in this particular moment of the summer of 1883, standing in the town of Harlow, Arizona Territory, with a stranger's charity tucked into her brown paper parcels, and a feeling in her chest she absolutely could not afford to investigate. The Wilcox family had come to the Arizona Territory in 1871, when Della was 14 years old and her father, Robert Wilcox, had convinced himself, and everyone who loved him, that the land was going to save them all. Robert Wilcox was a man of profound optimism and limited practical sense, and Della had adored him completely, which was the great tragedy of her life up to that point. He had bought 400 acres south of what would become Harlow, acres that should have been good cattle country, acres that he had imagined running cattle over, and for several years in the early and middle part of the decade, things had been acceptable, not prosperous, not the dream he had sold her mother on before she died of fever in the summer of 1874, but acceptable, enough. Then the drought came. Then the cattle prices collapsed in 1878, in a way that broke a dozen outfits across the territory. Then Robert Wilcox, who had never been a cautious man, took out a loan from the Territorial Bank to try to rebuild his herd, and the loan had compound interest that he did not fully understand. And by the time he sat Della down at the kitchen table in the spring of 1880 and showed her the paperwork, the numbers were genuinely terrifying. He had died in February of 1882, which was the most selfish thing he had ever done, though Della could not bring herself to say that out loud. He had died of a chest infection that a stronger man might have survived, and he had left her the land and the debt, and a small, battered tin box that contained $40 in cash, 3 legal documents she needed a lawyer to translate, and a letter that began with "I am sorry, Della," and did not improve substantially from there. She had come to Harlow proper in the spring of 1882 because the ranch was not functioning and she needed work. She had found work as a seamstress because she was good with her hands and because the ladies of Harlow needed someone to hem their skirts and mend their Sunday clothing and occasionally make something new for a wedding or a dance. It was honest work and she was good at it, and for a while she had thought she might actually be all right. What she had not anticipated, what she had not seen coming even though in retrospect it was obvious, was that the railroad spur that everyone in Harlow had been counting on since 1880 was simply not going to come. The surveyors had been out twice. Both times they had ridden away and not returned, and the word that eventually drifted back through channels was that the line was going through Yuma instead, 20 miles to the west, and that was that. And when the railroad did not come, the anticipated flood of new settlers did not come, and the economic growth that every merchant and craftsman in Harlow had been counting on quietly failed to materialize. Della's customers started making their own clothing. Mrs. Pratt at the millinery cut back on alterations work she sent out because she needed the income herself. 3 of Della's regular clients moved their families to Yuma to be nearer the rail line, and 2 more moved back east entirely. By the end of 1882, her income had been cut by more than half, and by the spring of 1883, it was a thin and desperate trickle that covered her rent on the small house on Mesquite Street and not much else. She had sold what she could: her mother's silver brush set, a good wool coat, the second horse, and then the first horse when things got genuinely critical. She had written to her cousin in Missouri 3 times asking for help, and received one vague and sympathetic reply that contained no money and no concrete offer. She had been eating oatmeal and dried beans for the better part of 3 months, and she had been doing it without telling a living soul, because the one thing she had retained from the wreckage of everything else was her dignity, and she was not ready to give that up. Until today. Until the dime. Until Elijah Ellsworth's hand coming past her shoulder with exact change and no explanation. She stood on that boardwalk for another 30 seconds, which was as long as she could afford to stand there feeling things, and then she pushed herself off the wall, tucked her parcels more firmly against her chest, and walked home. The house on Mesquite Street had been a reasonable size once, or at least it had felt that way when she first rented it and filled it with the furniture she had brought from the ranch. Now, with several pieces sold off for cash over the preceding months, it felt hollowed out, like a body from which the essential organs had been removed. The parlor had a settee and a single chair because she had sold the other chair in March. The kitchen had a table and one matching chair because the other 3 had gone in February. She had kept the bed because she was not that desperate yet, and the large oak wardrobe that had belonged to her mother, because she could not bring herself to part with it even when a very dark part of her had done the arithmetic and figured out exactly what it was worth. She set her parcels on the kitchen table and sat down in her single kitchen chair and put her face in her hands. She did not cry. She thought about it, considered the option seriously, and then decided against it because crying felt like giving in to something, though she could not have said precisely what. Instead, she sat there in the quiet of the afternoon and let the full weight of what had happened in Caldwell settle over her, and then she began, methodically and practically, to figure out what she was going to do next. The problem was not just that she was broke. The problem was that now at least one person knew it, and that one person was Elijah Ellsworth, who had a reputation in Harlow for being perceptive to the point of discomfort, and for never doing anything without a reason. She had watched him from a distance for 2 years without particularly wanting to. It was difficult not to watch Elijah Ellsworth in a town the size of Harlow. He was a presence that occupied its own particular gravity, the kind of man who walked through a room and rearranged it slightly just by virtue of being in it. He was not loud about this. He was not showy. He wore his authority the way some men wore a favorite coat, like something that belonged to him naturally and without effort. She knew his professional history in the way you knew everyone's professional history in a town of 400 people. He had come to Harlow from Tucson 6 years ago to take the sheriff's position after the previous occupant of the office had gotten himself killed in a dispute that had more to do with a card game than with law enforcement. He had restored order to the town within 3 months in a way that nobody had quite expected, not through violence, though he was apparently capable of that too, but through a combination of absolute consistency and what people described, admiringly or nervously depending on their own legal standing, as an almost supernatural ability to figure out what was true. She knew he was unmarried, which was not a secret. She knew he had a younger brother somewhere back east, because she had once overheard him mention it to Dr. Abernathy over a chess game through the open window of the doctor's office. She knew he took his coffee black and his meals at the hotel dining room most evenings, and that he read actual books, not just newspapers, because she had seen him once through the window of his office with his boots up on the desk and a novel open across his chest. She also knew, with a clarity that was more annoying than comforting, that he was one of the most genuinely decent men she had ever encountered in her life, which was completely inconvenient given her present circumstances. She could not afford the complication of Elijah Ellsworth. She could not afford, frankly, the complication of anybody. What she needed was more work, and she needed it now. She stood up from the kitchen table, pushed her shoulders back, and began to make flour and salt biscuits for her supper, because doing something physical and purposeful was the only reliable antidote she had ever found for the particular poison of her own thoughts. She had been making biscuits for approximately 4 minutes when the knock came at her front door. She knew before she opened it. She did not know how she knew, only that she did, with a certainty that settled into her stomach like a stone. She smoothed her hands on her apron and walked through the hollowed-out parlor and opened the door, and there was Elijah Ellsworth on her front steps, still holding his hat in one hand, and carrying a small cloth-wrapped package in the other that he held out toward her with the directness of a man who had rehearsed this moment, and decided that the quickest route through it was the best one. "Mrs. Wilcox," he said, "I apologize for calling unannounced." "Miss Wilcox," she corrected, because that was the kind of reflexive armor she still put on automatically. "I never married." Something shifted very slightly in his expression. "Miss Wilcox," he said, "I was in the store and I noticed you were short. I'm not here to make anything uncomfortable. I brought back what I spent so you can repay me when it suits you, if that suits you, and if it doesn't, then call it a neighbor being neighborly and don't think on it further." She looked at the package he was holding out. She looked at him. He was meeting her eyes with the same steady, unperformative directness he apparently brought to everything, and there was no pity in it. She had braced herself for pity. She had built a whole internal fortress to defend against pity. But what she saw in Elijah Ellsworth's face was something closer to respect, which was so unexpected that she had to readjust her entire defensive architecture on the spot. "You counted that out before you came into the store," she said. He did not look away. "I did. You planned to pay if I came up short." "I did." She breathed in through her nose. "That implies you knew I was struggling before today." "Yes," he said simply. The silence between them had weight and texture. "How long have you known?" she asked. "Long enough," he said, which was not a real answer, and they both understood that, but there was something in the way he said it that was not evasion but rather a kind of careful protection, as though the specifics of what he knew were a thing he would not weaponize against her. She took the package from his hand. It felt like coins wrapped in cloth. She held it in both hands. "I'll repay you," she said. "Every cent. I'm not a charity case, Sheriff." "I didn't come here because I think you're a charity case," he said, and his voice had a slight edge to it now that was not unkind but was very direct. "I came because I didn't want you to wonder about my intentions. The money means nothing to me. The wondering was going to bother you. That's the whole of it." She stared at him. He put his hat back on. "Good evening, Miss Wilcox." And he walked off her front steps and down Mesquite Street in the evening light with his coat settling around him and his stride unhurried, and Della stood in her doorway with the wrapped coins in her hands and the unsettling, deeply inconvenient feeling that she had just encountered something she did not have a category for. She slept badly. She lay in the darkness of her bedroom with the coin package on the nightstand beside her, because she could not bring herself to put it somewhere else, and she stared at the ceiling and tried to think about practical things, sewing work and letters she needed to write, and whether the flour she had bought would be enough for the week. And instead she thought about Elijah Ellsworth's face in the doorway light, the particular quality of his attention when it was directed at her. She had been alone for a long time. Not just since her father died, long before that. The loneliness had begun, she thought, when her mother died and she and Robert Wilcox had been left to orbit each other in the big, underfurnished ranch house, both of them grieving and neither of them with the vocabulary for it. She had learned to be self-sufficient as a matter of survival. She had learned to need nothing from anyone, or at least to perform that convincingly. She had not realized until just now, lying in the dark with the specific weight of Ellsworth's directness still pressing against her sternum, how exhausting that performance had been. She was up before dawn. She made oatmeal and ate it standing at the kitchen counter, and then she sat down at her sewing table, which occupied the corner of the parlor where the second armchair used to be, and she wrote 3 letters. One to the hotel, offering her services for curtain making and linen mending. One to the stage line, offering to do repair work on their driver coats and equipment straps. One to the school teacher, Miss Clara Vaughn, who she had heard was trying to organize a sewing bee and might need someone to teach the finer points of pattern work to the women who wanted to learn. She did not write a letter to Elijah Ellsworth. She held the coin package for a moment, weighing it literally and figuratively, and then she set it on the top shelf of the wardrobe, next to the small wooden box that had come from her father, and she went to the post office before it opened and slipped all 3 envelopes under the door. 3 days passed. She heard nothing, which was not surprising. She mended a torn vest for Mr. Greer at the hardware store, which paid 50 cents, and she took in a dress for the banker's wife, Mrs. Holloway, who was apparently planning to attend a church social in her best black dress and needed the hem corrected. That paid $1, and Della laid it in the tin box on the kitchen shelf with the reverence of someone depositing something sacred. On the 4th day, 2 things happened. The first was that Clara Vaughn appeared at her door at 11 in the morning with flushed cheeks and an excited manner, and offered her $3 a week to come to the schoolroom on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons for the Women's Sewing Circle, which had 12 interested participants and needed someone who actually knew what they were doing. Della said yes before the sentence was fully finished. The second was that she was crossing Main Street on her way back from the schoolroom, where she had gone to look at the space and understand what she needed to bring, when she nearly walked directly into Elijah Ellsworth, who was coming around the corner from the direction of his office with a piece of paper in his hand and his mind obviously somewhere else. They both stopped. The street was moderately busy, which meant there were probably 6 people who would witness whatever happened next and report on it to 6 others by supper time. "Miss Wilcox," he said. He recovered more quickly than she did. "Sheriff." She adjusted the shawl she was carrying over her arm. "I'm glad I've seen you. I'll have your money back to you by the end of the week." He looked at her for a moment. "There's no urgency," he said. "There is to me," she said, and she could hear in her own voice the wire-taught pride that she could never quite unlearn. "I've taken on additional work, the sewing circle." Something in his expression changed in a way she could not quite read. "That's good news," he said, and he seemed to mean it. "Clara Vaughn has been trying to get that organized for a year." "She mentioned," Della said, and then because she was still bad at small talk and always had been, and because the conversation felt like it was going to end and she was experiencing the bizarre sensation of not wanting it to, she said, "You knew I was in trouble for a while. You watched me, without saying anything." "I didn't think it was my place to say anything," he said, "but it was your place to do something." Doing something quietly seemed less likely to cause offense than doing something loudly, he said, and there was a faint, dry quality to it that she recognized after a moment as his particular variety of humor, so understated it was almost invisible. She looked at him for a moment. "I'm not sure whether to be grateful or annoyed," she said honestly. "You can be both," he said. "Most people are." And there it was again, that thing she did not have a category for, that quality in him that combined an almost inconvenient level of self-awareness with a genuine lack of vanity about it. And Della realized, standing in the middle of Main Street with the June heat pressing down on them both, that she was dangerously close to liking Elijah Ellsworth in a way that she was not going to be able to manage as tidily as she managed everything else. "Good afternoon, Sheriff," she said, and she moved past him before she could do something inadvisable. She did not look back. She was almost certain that he watched her go. The sewing circle began the following Tuesday, and it turned out to be genuinely wonderful, which surprised Della, who had expected it to be merely practical. The 12 women who showed up in Clara Vaughn's schoolroom that afternoon ranged in age from 17 to nearly 60. And they ranged in skill from women who had been sewing their own clothing for decades and just wanted community to women who had never in their lives held a needle with any purpose except to close a wound. Della found, to her considerable surprise, that she was good at teaching, that she had a patience for explanation she had not known she possessed, and that being in a room full of women who were genuinely interested in what she knew produced a warmth in her chest that she had been missing for a long time without being fully aware of it. Mrs. Helena Pratt was there, which Della had not anticipated and which required a certain internal recalibration because Mrs. Pratt was not a comfortable presence at the best of times. But even Mrs. Pratt, who had a sharp tongue and sharper eyes and a near-professional interest in other people's business, was subdued in the context of learning something. And by the end of the first session, she and Della had conducted an entire conversation about buttonhole construction that was almost entirely without subtext. Della walked home in the long summer evening feeling lighter than she had in months. The tin on the kitchen shelf now held $3 from Mrs. Holloway and 50 cents from Mr. Greer and the promise of more to come, and the sewing circle meant $3 a week recurring, and she had received a note from the hotel that morning saying, "Yes, please come discuss the curtain work at your earliest convenience." The arithmetic was still challenging. It was going to be challenging for a long time, but for the first time since her father's death she could see a path through it, and that was a thing worth something. She passed the sheriff's office on the way home. The door was open and the lamp inside was lit against the deepening dusk, and she could see Elijah Ellsworth at his desk, bent over something. She told herself she was not going to stop. She stopped. "Working late," she said from the doorway. He looked up. He did not seem surprised to see her. "Deputy's off with a chest cold. I'm covering the evening." He paused. "How did it go?" "How did what go?" "The sewing circle." She leaned against the door frame. "Well," she said, "it went well. Mrs. Pratt is a very focused student when she has no one to gossip about." The corner of his mouth moved. "She's a focused everything when the conditions are right," he said. Della looked at him for a moment. His desk was ordered in the way of a mind that processed a great deal and needed external systems to keep track of it, neat but dense, papers in stacks, a mug of coffee at the corner, a legal book open to a page he had apparently been studying. The lamp threw warm light across the planes of his face and made him look less like the slightly forbidding official presence he occupied in the town's collective imagination, and more like what he apparently actually was, a thoughtful man working late on a quiet Tuesday. "Why did you come to Harlow?" she asked, and then felt immediately that she had overstepped, which was annoying because she never overstepped. That was not who she was. But he did not seem to mind the question. He sat back in his chair and considered it with the same seriousness he apparently brought to everything. "The post was vacant," he said. "I was looking for somewhere I could stay." "You were looking for permanence," she said. "Tucson didn't have it," he said. "Harlow seemed like it might." She thought about this. She thought about what it meant to look for permanence in a place, the particular kind of rootedness that was about choosing rather than inheriting a home. She had not chosen Harlow. She had arrived in it at 14, following her father's dream, and had stayed because there was nowhere else to go. She had never thought of it as chosen. "Do you like it?" she asked. "After 6 years, do you still think it was the right choice?" He looked at her steadily. "I've started to think so more recently," he said. She felt the weight of that sentence in a way she was quite sure she was not supposed to. Or rather, she felt it and she was quite sure he had intended her to, and that was somehow more significant. She pushed herself off the door frame. "Good night, Sheriff." "Good night, Miss Wilcox," he said, and went back to his papers, and she walked the rest of the way home in the dark. She repaid him on Friday. She came to the office in the middle of the morning when the street was busy and the interaction would look like ordinary business, and she put the wrapped coin package on his desk and said, "Every cent." And he looked at it and then looked at her and said, "Thank you," in a tone that contained things she was choosing not to unpack, and she nodded once and left. She told herself that was the end of it. She told herself that a debt repaid was a social interaction concluded, that there was no reason for any ongoing connection, that the sensible and practical thing was to be grateful and move forward and concentrate on rebuilding what she had lost. She told herself this on Friday. By Sunday she was not entirely believing it, and by the following Tuesday, When she arrived at the schoolroom for the sewing circle and found Elijah Ellsworth out front talking to Clara Vaughn about what appeared to be a broken latch on the schoolroom door, she had mostly given up. He fixed the latch while they were inside having the sewing circle. When they came out, it was done, and he was gone, and Clara Vaughn said, "He does that kind of thing all the time. People don't notice him doing it because he doesn't make a thing of it." And she said it with an expression that suggested she was not just talking about door latches. Della noticed him doing things. Once she started noticing, she could not stop, which was the irritating nature of attention. He fixed the door. He apparently also had a conversation with Gerald Caldwell that resulted in Caldwell quietly extending an informal line of credit to several residents he knew were struggling, himself included, though Della only heard about this secondhand and could not confirm the sheriff's role in it. He was at the church social in July and sat with the Hendersons, who had lost their eldest son that spring, and talked with them for an hour and a half in a corner while everyone else danced, and the look on old Thomas Henderson's face during that conversation was the look of a man being held together by something. She also noticed that he noticed her. Not in the obvious way, not in the way of men who made their attention into a kind of claim. More like someone tracking a weather pattern, consistently aware of direction and pressure and what it might mean for tomorrow. They talked more. It was not arranged or planned. It simply happened, the way things happen in small towns where people occupy the same geography day after day, and the social routes develop their own grooves. She stopped at the office some evenings when the light was on. He stopped at her corner once when she was examining the hem of a jacket she was mending on the front steps, because the light inside was not good enough, and they talked for 40 minutes about nothing that mattered and everything that did, the kind of conversation where the actual content is just the surface and what's really being exchanged is harder to name. She learned things about him in these conversations. He had grown up in Virginia, which explained some things about the careful formality he wore along with his badge. His father had been a carpenter, and his mother had taught school, which explained other things. He had gone west at 22 with something he described only as the desire to be somewhere the past wasn't following me, which was the closest thing to a dark past revelation she extracted from him in weeks of talking, and which she did not push on because she recognized in it a very familiar shape. He learned things about her too. She could tell by the quality of his listening. She told him about her mother's death, which she had not discussed with anyone in Harlow in 2 years. She told him about her father's optimism and its consequences, and he listened to that without flinching or offering easy comfort, which she valued more than she could express. She told him about the sewing circle, about the unexpected pleasure of teaching, about Mrs. Pratt's buttonholes and how they were becoming genuinely excellent. She did not tell him about the loneliness. She did not need to. She had the sense he already knew about it, the way he apparently knew most things, quietly and without announcement. The thing that shifted it, the thing that broke open what they had been carefully building without naming it, happened in August. There was a man who came to Harlow named Cresswell, first name Victor, last name Trouble, who arrived on the stage from Tucson and within 3 days had positioned himself as a land speculator with business that involved half the property owners in town and a very persuasive manner and a smile that did not reach his eyes. He was specifically interested in the Wilcox land south of town. He had apparently done his research and knew exactly what Della owed to the Territorial Bank, and what the foreclosure timeline looked like if she could not maintain payments, and he came to see her on a Wednesday afternoon with a very smooth offer, and a document already drawn up. She sat across her kitchen table from him, with his document between them and her single kitchen chair beneath her, and she read every word of it while he talked pleasantly about what a burden land could be for a woman alone, and how much better off she would be with a cash settlement, and the freedom to start fresh somewhere else. He was offering her $800 for 400 acres of land that was worth, conservatively, $3,000. She pushed the document back across the table to him and said, "No." He smiled. The smile still did not reach his eyes. He said that he understood she needed time to think about it and that his offer was very generous considering her circumstances, and he left the document on her table when he departed, which told her something significant about how he regarded the word no. She sat in her kitchen for a long time after he left. Then she got up, put on her hat and shawl, picked up the document and walked to the sheriff's office. Elijah Ellsworth read the document twice. He did not speak while he was reading it. When he finished, he set it down on his desk and looked at it for a moment and then looked at her. "He's done this before," he said. It was not a question. "That was my impression," she said. "I'm going to look into Cresswell," he said. "In the meantime, don't sign anything. Don't meet with him again without a witness." "I don't intend to," she said. "But there's a real problem underneath this, Sheriff. The bank loan, my father's debt. Cresswell found it because it's real and it's on record, and whatever you find out about him doesn't make the debt go away." He looked at her steadily. "Have you spoken to a lawyer about it?" "I can't afford a lawyer." "Daniel Hargreaves on Canyon Street does consultation for free for the first meeting," he said. "He does it because he believes in it. Go see him." She stared at him. "You know this because of some other resident you helped," she said. He did not confirm or deny this. "Go see Hargreaves," he said. "The debt may be more manageable than Cresswell wants you to believe." She went to see Daniel Hargreaves the next morning. He was a small man in his 50s with spectacles and an extremely orderly office, and he read her father's loan documents with the focused attention of a man who had been looking for exactly this kind of problem his whole professional life. He told her four things: that the original interest terms were aggressive but legal, that the bank had made an error in the compound calculation that had added $14 to the outstanding balance illegally, that the foreclosure timeline gave her 9 months, not the 3 that Cresswell had somehow implied, and that if she could make a partial payment in good faith within 30 days, the bank was almost certainly required to restructure rather than foreclose, because there had been a territorial Supreme Court ruling on exactly this point in 1881. She walked out of Hargreaves's office and stood on Canyon Street in the August heat and felt, for the first time in nearly 2 years, like the ground beneath her feet was something she actually owned. She went to the sheriff's office. She was not thinking clearly about why. She was not thinking at all, really. She was just moving toward the thing that had become instinctive in the past months, toward him, toward the particular steady warmth of his presence. And when she pushed open the door, he looked up from his desk, and whatever he saw in her face made him stand up immediately. "Hargreaves," she said. "He found something. The bank made a calculation error. And the timeline is 9 months, not 3. Something moved in his face. "Della," he said. It was the first time he had used her given name. They both heard it. He did not correct it, and she did not ask him to. "I'm going to keep the land," she said. "I'm going to figure it out, but I needed to tell you." She stopped. "I needed to tell you because you're the reason I went to Hargreaves, and you're the reason I walked into Caldwell's that day instead of going without, which I was going to do. You're the reason for several things lately, and I don't know what to do with that." The silence was the kind that had its own specific texture and temperature. He came around from behind the desk. He stopped at a distance that was correct for what they were to each other and also completely insufficient, and he said, "I have been trying to be careful with you." "I know," she said. "I've noticed you're very careful with me." "Because you have enough weight on you," he said, "and because I didn't want to add to it." "You haven't," she said. "You've been the opposite of adding to it. That's the thing I'm trying to tell you." He looked at her for a long moment. His expression had that quality she had come to recognize over months of conversation, the quality of a man who thought before he spoke and meant what he said when he did, which was so rare in her experience that she still found it slightly startling every time. "I'd like to call on you," he said, "properly, if you'd allow it." She breathed. "Yes," she said, "I'd allow it." And that was how it began, or rather, how it was acknowledged, Because the truth was it had been something since the moment a large, sun-browned hand had reached past her at the counter of Caldwell's general store with exact change and no fanfare, and they both knew it. He called on her that Sunday, which was the conventional time for such things in 1883, and they sat in the parlor on the settee and single chair respectively, with the door to the outside left open as propriety required, and they talked for 2 hours. It was different from the conversations they had been having, not in substance but in acknowledged intent, and the difference felt like taking off a piece of armor that you had forgotten you were wearing, the relief of it physical and almost dizzying. He told her about Virginia Moore. His father's workshop, the smell of sawdust and lacquer, the particular quality of summer light there that was different from desert light in a way he could still feel when he tried to remember it. He told her about a woman he had known at 20, briefly, who had married someone else, and the telling of it was honest without being dramatic, a fact of his past rather than a wound, and she understood from the way he described it that he had not been in love since then in any serious way, which she found simultaneously surprising and somehow exactly right. She told him about a man named Peterson who had courted her briefly in 1879, before her father's financial troubles had become apparent, and who had lost interest with remarkable efficiency once the troubles became known. She told it flatly, without anger, because the anger had burned through already in the years since, and what was left was just the lesson, which was that she was better at trusting her own perceptions now. "That's a specific kind of betrayal," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "It was good to learn it early, though. It made me careful about what I show people." He looked at her. "You're careful about everything," he said. "You don't let people in easily." "No," she said. "And yet here we are," he said quietly. She met his eyes. "And yet here we are," she agreed. He came again the following Sunday, and the Sunday after that. Victor Cresswell, meanwhile, turned out to be exactly what Elijah had suspected he was, a man with a pattern of predatory land acquisition across the territory, using accurate financial research and false urgency to pressure vulnerable landowners into selling far below value. Elijah sent a series of letters to his counterparts in Tucson and Bisbee, and received confirmations that the pattern was documented, and that Cresswell was the subject of ongoing investigation by the territorial attorney's office. He delivered this information to Della with the satisfaction of a man who had been patient about something and watched it resolve correctly. And he also told her that Cresswell had left Harlow the previous Tuesday without the document Della had refused to sign, which she received with a relief so profound it made her dizzy. She went to the bank with Daniel Hargreaves at her elbow in early September, and they had a conversation with the branch manager, Mr. Fielding, that was quite unlike the imagined conversation she had rehearsed in her worst nights over the past year. The $14 error was corrected. A restructured payment schedule was agreed upon, one she could realistically meet on her growing income from the sewing circle and the hotel work and the occasional large commission. The land south of town remained hers. She walked out of the bank on Elijah's arm, which was a thing that had happened organically and which she did not examine until she had been doing it for half a block and then found she did not want to stop. He looked sideways at her. "All right," he said. "Better than all right," she said. "I feel like I can breathe." "You've been breathing the whole time," he said. "I watched you do it," she laughed. It was a genuine laugh, unguarded, and it surprised them both. "That is perhaps the most literal thing you have ever said to me," she said. "I try to keep a few in reserve," he said, and there was that almost invisible smile of his, the one that required you to be paying close attention to catch it, and she was always paying close attention. They had dinner at the hotel dining room that evening, which was the first time they had been somewhere that clearly constituted a public date, and the two of them being seen together at a table was noted by several people who had opinions about it. The opinions, as they filtered back to Della over the following days through the medium of the sewing circle, were mixed in the way that opinions about any woman's choices in any small town in 1883 were inevitably mixed. Mrs. Pratt thought it was very proper since the sheriff was the most eligible man in town. Mrs. Henderson thought it was lovely, and said so directly to Della's face, which was the kind of direct warmth Della still did not quite know how to receive. 2 or 3 women of the more conventional variety apparently had thoughts about whether it was appropriate for a woman in Della's financial circumstances to be socializing rather than working, which made Della's jaw tighten in a specific way she recognized as inherited from her mother. Elijah, when she told him about this last category of opinion, said, "People who have opinions about how other people manage their poverty are usually people who have never had to manage their own," and said it with a calm certainty that closed the subject entirely. The autumn came to Harlow in the way autumn came to Arizona, which was to say that the brutal edge of the summer heat softened gradually, and the evenings became genuinely beautiful, cool and clear, and full of a western sky that turned colors at sunset that no painter Della had ever seen had managed to accurately reproduce. She spent those evenings differently now. She still worked, because work was both necessary and, she was coming to realize, genuinely satisfying to her in a way she had not previously understood. But the evenings belonged to other things. To the sewing circle, which had expanded to 15 participants and was being discussed as a possible permanent institution. To occasional evenings at the hotel dining room with Elijah. To the conversations on his office steps or her front porch that had become the architecture of something she was only now learning to name. She admitted to herself in October that she was in love with him. She admitted it privately, sitting at her sewing table in the early morning with the light just beginning and a half-finished commission in her lap, and she sat with the admission for a while before she decided what to do with it. She was not afraid of the feeling exactly. She was cautious about it the way she was cautious about everything that mattered, the way a person who has been poor long enough to know what poverty does handles something valuable, with attention, with both hands. She also admitted to herself that she was fairly certain he was in love with her, because Elijah Ellsworth was not a man who spent his Sunday afternoons and his weekday evenings and his specific focused attention on things he was not serious about. The thing that confirmed this, that moved it from the space of private admission to the space of acknowledged truth between them, happened on a Thursday evening in late October when she had been working late on the hotel curtain order and had walked home in the dark and found him sitting on her front steps waiting for her. He stood up when he heard her coming. The lamp light from the Garcia's window next door caught him, and she could see that his face held something she had not seen in it before, a kind of determined vulnerability that sat awkwardly on a man who wore composure the way other men wore their skin. "You're late coming home," he said, which was not a complaint but which was clearly the cover story for why he was there. "I finished the gold curtains," she said. "Mr. Jeffers wants them up by next week." He nodded. He did not move to let her pass. He said, "Della." "Yes," she said. "I want to say something and I'm going to say it plainly because I don't know another way," he said. "I have been in Harlow for 6 years and it has been a life I chose and I've been satisfied with it. Since the spring I have been more than satisfied with it, and the specific difference is you, and I'm not willing to not say that anymore." She looked at him in the lamplight. Her heart was doing something impractical. "You've been not saying it for a while," she said. "I have," he said. "I was trying to be careful. I'm not sure I was careful for the right reasons. I think I might have been careful for my own reasons because it's easier to not say things than to say them and be uncertain about the answer." "Are you uncertain about the answer?" she asked. He looked at her steadily. "Less and less," he said. She took one step forward. He was very still. "I am in love with you," she said, because she was Della Wilcox and she had survived enough things that she was not going to be coy about this particular one. "I am in love with you and I have been for a while and I want you to know it." He exhaled. It was almost the first time she had seen him do anything that could be described as a release of tension, the first time she had seen that composure give way to something underneath it, and what was underneath it was warmth, straightforward and enormous and entirely directed at her. "Della," he said, and his voice was different, lower and quieter and full of things she had been catching glimpses of for months. "I love you. I have been finding reasons to walk past your house for 3 months." She laughed, again that unguarded laugh that still surprised her a little. "I know," she said. "I noticed." "Of course you noticed," he said, and there was something in it that was almost helpless, which was such an unlikely quality in Elijah Ellsworth that she found it devastating in the best possible way. He took her hand. It was the first time he had done it, and it was deliberate and careful and completely certain all at once, and she looked down at their joined hands in the lamplight and felt something in her chest that she could only describe as the ending of a very long holding of breath. They stood on her front steps in the cool October evening and talked for another hour, and the talking was different from all the previous talking. Not the careful architecture of two people building something they weren't naming, but the open, lighter conversation of two people who have named it and are now figuring out what to build with it. He proposed in November. He did it in the same way he did everything, without ceremony for its own sake but with complete seriousness. And he did it in the sheriff's office because that was where they happened to be when the moment arrived, which was not traditional but was entirely characteristic of them both. He had a ring that had belonged to his mother, a simple gold band with a small inset turquoise stone that was so clearly the right object that Della could not have designed a better one herself, and he held it in his palm and asked her to marry him without preamble or rehearsed speech, just his own words spoken directly, which was the only way he ever spoke. She said yes. She said it the way she had said "I love you," with her whole chest and no qualification, and he put the ring on her finger and they sat together in the warm lamplit office, and Della looked down at the turquoise catching the light and felt the specific overwhelming sensation of a life rearranging itself around something true. They were married in February of 1884. It was a small wedding, which was what they both wanted, in the church on the corner of Main and 2nd with Clara Vaughn as Della's witness and Deputy Tom Aldrich as Elijah's. It had been 14 months since a large, sun-browned hand had reached past Della Wilcox at Caldwell's counter with exact change and no explanation. And the symmetry of that, the private joke of it, was something they shared in a look across the church, while Reverend Haskell found his place in the ceremony. The reception was held in the hotel dining room, courtesy of Mr. Jeffers, who had apparently decided that putting up the gold curtains gave him a stake in the sheriff's happiness, and most of Harlow was there. Mrs. Pratt gave a toast that was mostly about herself but ended graciously. Mrs. Henderson cried in the way that people cry at weddings when they are genuinely happy and have also been very sad for a while, and the happiness is slightly overwhelming. Gerald Caldwell shook Elijah's hand and gave Della a look that was the closest thing to an apology she was likely to get from him, and she took it in the spirit in which it was offered. She moved into Elijah's house, which was larger than her Mesquite Street rental, and had been a bachelor's house in specific ways she found both charming and correctable. They painted the kitchen together in March, a project that took 3 times as long as it should have, because the conversation was too interesting to rush for. She brought her mother's wardrobe and its small wooden box and installed them in the bedroom with the care of things that had crossed a long distance to arrive somewhere right. The tin on the kitchen shelf, the tin from her father's house, she kept it. It had $23 in it now, which was its own particular kind of triumph. The land south of town became something she addressed properly in the spring of 1884, which was the first spring of her marriage, and the first spring in several years, when she could approach it without the cold hand of dread around her throat. She and Elijah rode out to it on a Saturday morning in April, the first time she had seen it since her father's death, and they sat on their horses at the top of the low ridge that overlooked the eastern quarter, and she showed him what it had been and what it could be. "Cattle, if we can capitalize it properly," she said. "Not immediately, but the land is good. Hargreaves confirmed that there are no further encumbrances now that the bank debt is restructured. In 3 years, maybe 4, it could be running a modest herd. We, he said. She looked at him. Yes, she said, we. He looked out over the land with that specific quality of his attention that meant he was actually seeing it, not just looking at it. My father would have known exactly how to build the fence line, he said. I'm going to have to find someone to teach me, she laughed. I know something about fence lines, she said. My father's ranch hands spent half my childhood explaining them to me in detail, and I absorbed more than I intended to. He looked at her with that expression she loved most, the one that combined warmth and amusement and something deeper underneath, the expression that said he found her perpetually interesting and could not quite believe his luck, which she found affecting every single time. Of course you do, he said. They rode back to town in the warm spring morning with their horses walking companionably alongside each other, and the territory opening up around them in every direction. And Della felt the thing she had been working toward for years without quite knowing what it was. Not just security, not just stability, but the specific feeling of being exactly where she was supposed to be, in the particular place and the particular life, and next to the particular person that fit. The summer of 1884 was the best summer of Della's life up to that point. The sewing circle continued to grow and had become a genuine institution in Harlow, with a waiting list and a small but real reputation that had brought women from surrounding settlements to join on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Della had taken on an apprentice, a young woman named Sophie Reyes, who had extraordinary natural aptitude, and who Della was teaching with the same pleasure she had discovered in herself the first time she had explained buttonhole construction to Mrs. Pratt. The hotel curtain work had led to several additional commissions from other establishments in town, and her income, for the first time since she had come to Harlow, was not just surviving but genuinely accumulating. The debt to the Territorial Bank was paid off entirely in September of 1884. She and Elijah sat across from Mr. Fielding in his bank office, and she handed over the final payment and received the discharge documents, and Fielding congratulated her with the professional warmth of a man who had clearly been rooting for her outcome even when the odds had looked poor. She walked out of the bank and stood on the street, and Elijah stood beside her, and she held the discharge papers in both hands. My father would have been relieved, she said, and then immediately optimistic about the next thing. What's the next thing? Elijah asked. The land, she said. The cattle. I want to start properly planning it out. He put his arm around her shoulders, which he did often and which she still found unreasonably good every time. Then we plan it out, he said. In December of 1884 she told him she was pregnant, and she told him the way she told him everything, directly and without preamble, sitting at the kitchen table over their evening coffee. He went very still in the way she had come to recognize as his response to things that mattered enormously, and then he looked at her with an expression that she thought she would carry with her for the rest of her life. He moved his coffee cup aside and reached across the table and took both her hands in his. Are you all right? He asked. Are you well? Very well, she said. Dr. Abernathy confirmed it last week. I wanted to be certain before I said anything. Of course you did, he said softly, and there was in it such complete understanding of who she was, of why she waited to be certain before she spoke, that she felt her throat close in that specific way that still surprised her after nearly 2 years. Are you happy? She asked. He turned her hands over and pressed his mouth against her fingers briefly, which was more eloquent than anything he could have said, and he said, Della, yes, yes, I am. The baby came in August of 1885, a boy, which Elijah received with a particular quiet joy that was entirely characteristic of him, the joy of a man who felt things deeply and expressed them with precision rather than volume. They named him Robert James Ellsworth. Robert for Della's father, the optimistic and impractical man she had loved completely and forgiven thoroughly. James for Elijah's younger brother back in Virginia, who had sent a telegram of congratulations and a package containing a small carved wooden horse that had belonged to their father. Robert was a solid, good-natured baby who had Elijah's dark hair and Della's eyes, and a temperament that was already legible as stubborn in specific ways she recognized from both directions. He slept in a crib that Elijah had built himself in the spring, which had taken several weeks and multiple consultations with a carpenter named Morris who had an establishment on the edge of town, and which was absolutely beautiful in the way things built by people who are learning out of love tend to be. The sewing circle threw Della a welcome home party when she brought Robert to the schoolroom for the first time at 6 weeks old, and the 15 women of the circle were so collectively enthusiastic about him that she had to exercise some firm diplomacy to retrieve her son from Mrs. Henderson's arms in time for his feeding. Mrs. Pratt, who had a reputation for sharp remarks and cool assessments, looked at Robert for a long time and then said to Della with complete sincerity, "He has your steadiness. That will serve him." It was, Della thought, the nicest thing Mrs. Pratt had ever said to another human being, and she received it accordingly. Victor Cresswell, she heard in the autumn of 1885 through the professional channels Elijah still maintained, had been charged by the territorial attorney's office with fraudulent land speculation across 4 counties and was awaiting trial in Tucson. The outcome was expected to be a significant fine and possibly a short territorial prison term. Della noted this and felt a clean, complete satisfaction about it that required no further elaboration. She hired Sophie Reyes as a full-paid employee of the expanded sewing work in the spring of 1886, which freed Della to spend more time on the larger commissions and on the land planning that was beginning to feel genuinely possible. She and Elijah had engaged a rancher from outside Yuma named Hadley to advise on the cattle operation, and the plan that Hadley drew up with them over 2 days in February was careful and achievable, which was exactly what Della needed it to be. The first small herd, 20 head of cattle, would be in place by the autumn of 1886. She was also, by the spring of 1886, expecting their second child, which she again confirmed with Dr. Abernathy before she said anything, and which she told Elijah on a Tuesday evening while Robert, now 9 months old and experimenting aggressively with standing up, conducted a private investigation of the contents of the lower kitchen shelf. Elijah looked at her over the top of Robert's head. "Are you well?" he said, which was the first thing he said both times, which she found completely right. "Very well," she said. "Abernathy says January." He came around the table and gathered her into him, carefully because Robert had grabbed his knee at that moment and was using it as a standing support, and she pressed her face against his shirt and felt the steady beat of his heart against her cheek, and thought that there was no version of her future she had imagined from the kitchen table of the house on Mesquite Street, or from the ridge above the family land, or from anywhere in the years of surviving that had looked like this. Not because she had imagined something worse, but because she had not known to imagine something this specific. He kissed the top of her head and said into her hair, "A January baby. That was when the desert starts to believe in winter." "Briefly," she said, "and then it changes its mind." He laughed. She felt it in his chest. Robert, feeling excluded, produced a protest from the vicinity of their knees, and they separated to retrieve him, and the 3 of them were in the kitchen together in the evening light, and it was ordinary and it was extraordinary, and Della understood finally what her father had been reaching for all those years with his impractical optimism, and his bought acres and his letters that started with "I am sorry." He had been reaching for this, a life that felt worth the reaching. The second baby was a girl, born in January of 1887, with a voice that immediately established her as the most emphatic personality in the Ellsworth household, a judgment that was revised upward 3 times in the first week. They named her Anna Margaret Ellsworth, the Margaret for Elijah's mother, and she had Della's fair hair and a quality of absolute determination in her small face that made Dr. Abernathy say, with professional neutrality, that this child was going to have strong opinions about everything from very early on. He was correct. Anna Margaret Ellsworth had strong opinions from approximately the first month of her existence, and this, Della thought, was completely fine. Strong opinions were useful. She had built something with her own. The cattle operation started in autumn of 1886 as planned, with 20 head and a hired hand named Cortez, who knew the land and knew cattle, and turned out to be exactly as reliable as Hadley had described him. By the spring of 1888, they were at 40 head, and the operation was making a modest but real profit that Della entered in the ledger on the kitchen shelf, with a precision and thoroughness that was entirely its own satisfaction. The sewing circle in 1888 had grown to 22 members and had recently been formalized as the Harlow Women's Cooperative, with a small fee structure and a charter document that Della and Clara Vaughan had drafted together over several evenings, and which Hargreaves had reviewed and pronounced legally sound. The cooperative provided sewing instruction, clothing repair services for reduced rates to families who needed it, and was beginning to discuss the possibility of a small lending library of pattern books and dressmaking manuals, which was Clara's particular passion project, and which Della had agreed to fund partially from the cooperative's small surplus. She was 31 years old. She had 2 children and a husband she loved with a constancy that surprised her not in its existence, but in its quality, in the way it grew rather than settled, in the way Elijah Ellsworth at 6 years of marriage was more known to her and more interesting to her than he had been at 2, which was not something she had been told to expect from the admittedly limited sources she had consulted on the subject. He was still the sheriff of Harlow. He would, she thought, be the sheriff of Harlow for as long as he wanted to be, because the town had arranged itself around his presence with the completeness of something that could no longer imagine itself in a different configuration. He was not universally beloved, because the law was never universally beloved, and he would have been deeply suspicious of himself if it were. But he was respected in a way that had become foundational, the kind of respect that was not about personality or charm, but about the accumulated evidence of a man who did what he said, and said what was true. She watched him across the table at dinner, and across the room at the hotel during community events, and across the distance of their land south of town, when they rode out on Saturdays to check on the cattle, and she thought about the hand reaching past her at the counter of Caldwell's General Store. She thought about the particular quality of that gesture, the way it was both anonymous and entirely personal, the way it had been the most obvious possible expression of who he was before she knew who he was. Quiet and exact and entirely without performance. The complete opposite of what her life had taught her to expect. She thought about this one September evening in 1888, the 2 children asleep upstairs, the house quiet around them, Elijah reading at the kitchen table with his coffee going cold and his feet off the floor for once, his boots by the door. She was finishing a hem at her sewing table, the one she had brought from Mesquite Street and installed in the corner of their parlor where it caught the best light. The lamp on the table threw its warm circle. Outside the window the territorial stars were doing their extravagant thing. She bit off her thread and set down the finished garment and looked at him. He was absorbed in his book, which was Trollope, she thought, or possibly someone else whose name she could never quite remember. He had a small frown of concentration between his brows that she had learned to find endearing rather than forbidding. "Elijah," she said. He looked up immediately. This was one of the things about him. He was always present, always actually in the room, never half somewhere else in the way busy people sometimes were. "I was thinking about the day in Caldwell's," she said. He set the book down. "All right," he said. "I was thinking about it because Robert has been talking about wanting to understand how money works," she said, which was true. Robert had become fascinated with coins recently in the way 4-year-olds became fascinated with specific things as if their entire intellectual development depended on the subject. and I was thinking about how to explain it to him, what money is for and what it isn't for. What are you thinking of telling him? Elijah asked. She was quiet for a moment. I'm thinking of telling him that money is a practical thing, a tool, and that it is most useful when it serves people rather than when people serve it, and that the most important thing about how a person uses it is what it reveals about their understanding of what other people are worth. He was watching her with that complete attention. What you did in Caldwell's, she said, was an act of very sophisticated understanding about what I was worth. You weren't paying for my groceries. You were paying for my ability to walk out of that store with my dignity intact. Those are different things, and you knew the difference. The quiet in the room was the warm, domestic variety, the kind with 2 sleeping children in it, and a pot of coffee and the smell of a finished hem and years of conversation accumulated in the walls. I knew you were going to make it, he said. I was just trying to make sure the making it had a little more room in it. She looked at him across the lamplight. You are very good at what you do, she said. Della, he said, and there was that quality in her name when he said it, the same quality it had had the first time in September of 1883, something warm and entirely intentional. You are the most remarkable person I have ever encountered in my life. The making it was always going to be yours. I just happened to be standing in the right place at the right time. She set her sewing aside and crossed the kitchen, and he pushed his chair back to make room, and she sat on the edge of the table next to him, and he took her hands, the same way he had at this same kitchen table when she told him about Robert, the same way he had been taking her hand since October of 1883 on her front steps. I love you, she said. I love you, he said. Very much. For a very long time. She leaned her forehead against his, and they sat like that in the lamplight and the quiet. And outside the window the Arizona stars continued their extravagant performance for no one and everyone. The same stars they had been since long before there was a town called Harlow, or a woman named Della Wilcox, or a sheriff named Elijah Ellsworth. And the specific brightness of them was no different that night than any other night. But it felt different. The way everything feels different when you are looking at it from inside the life you were supposed to have. In the years that followed, the Ellsworth household on what was now known as Ellsworth Road, because the town had made it official in 1887 over Elijah's private protests, grew and changed in the way that houses full of people grow and change, which is to say constantly, and with considerable noise and occasional damage to furniture. Robert grew into a serious boy who had inherited his father's quality of attention and his mother's stubbornness in equal measure, a combination that his teachers found both admirable and occasionally exhausting. Anna Margaret grew into the person Dr. Abernathy had predicted, which was a person with loud, confident opinions about everything from the correct way to organize a kitchen shelf to the injustice of being told to be quiet in church. And Della found her entirely wonderful in the specific way of mothers who recognize themselves in their daughters and are not entirely sure whether to be proud or alarmed. There was a third child in 1890, another boy, who they named James after Elijah's brother, and who turned out to be the gentlest and most immediately lovable of the 3, with a quality of sunny contentment that was entirely his own, and which made the family wonder where it had come from, since neither of his parents had come by contentment particularly naturally. Elijah's brother actually came to visit in 1891, traveling from Virginia on the newly extended rail line to Yuma, and then by stage to Harlow. And his arrival was an event that Della had been both anticipating and mildly anxious about for 6 months. He turned out to be a man who shared Elijah's dark hair and his particular quality of stillness, but who expressed it with a warmth and talkativeness that his brother did not. And Della liked him from the first 10 minutes, and the relief of that was enormous. He stayed for 3 weeks, and by the end of it he and Robert were inseparable in the way of uncles and nephews who are 4 years old, and therefore find each other's humor at exactly the right level. James the brother, who they called James Sr. to distinguish from baby James, which Elijah said was the most undignified thing that had ever happened to the name, looked at the Ellsworth household and the cattle operation and the Harlow Women's Cooperative and the sheriff's office, and all the accumulated evidence of the life his brother had built in the Arizona territory, and he said to Elijah on his last evening, "I wasn't sure, for a long time, whether you'd found the thing you were looking for when you came out here. I can see you have." Elijah, who was holding baby James and watching Robert attempt to explain to Uncle James Sr. the precise mechanism by which a coin could be made to spin on a flat surface, said, "I wasn't entirely sure either for the first few years, and then I was." Della, who was nearby and heard this, and who had been hearing variations of it for 7 years now, and who thought she should probably by now be less affected by Elijah Ellsworth's specific variety of direct honesty, found that she was still entirely affected by it, and this seemed exactly right. Harlow itself changed through the 90s in the way frontier towns changed, when they survived long enough to stop being frontier towns and begin being something more permanent. The population grew. New buildings went up on the south end of Main Street. There was a proper school constructed in 1892 with 2 rooms and a clock above the door, which Clara Vaughn oversaw with the focused intensity she brought to educational matters. The hotel expanded. 2 new dry goods establishments opened, which put pressure on Caldwell's but not fatally so, and Gerald Caldwell responded by expanding his inventory in ways that were actually sensible, which surprised most of the town. The Ellsworth cattle operation reached 60 head by 1893, which was not a large operation, but was a sound one, and the land that Robert Wilcox had bought in 1871, with his characteristic combination of optimism and poor planning, was producing something real at last. Della drove out to check the operation on the first Saturday of every month without fail, sometimes with Elijah, sometimes alone, sometimes with whichever children she could persuade into the wagon, and she walked the boundary of the land her father had bought and felt the complicated love for him that time had made workable, the love that contained the grief and the frustration and the forgiveness and the gratitude, because without his impossible optimism she would not have been in Harlow. And without Harlow she would not have had any of this. She was 40 years old in 1897, and she knew with the same precision she brought to her ledger columns, the happiest she had ever been in her life, not in a simple or uncomplicated way. Happiness that had been earned through the specific curriculum of loss and work and choice was not a simple state. It was layered and complex, and it sat alongside a whole history of other feelings that did not disappear simply because the present was good. But it was real and it was specific and it was hers. Elijah was still the sheriff. He would serve until 1901, when he would hand the office to a capable deputy named Walsh and tell the town, which expressed considerable dismay about this, that 20 years was enough, and he had cattle and a library of books and a wife who had been patient about the hours and was owed some of the time back. The town gave him a dinner that was the largest gathering Harlow had ever organized, and Mrs. Henderson, who was very old now and very small but still entirely herself, got to her feet during the speeches and said, "He is the best man we have had in this town, in any office, in any year since I have been here," and said it in a voice that carried to every corner of the room, and the silence that followed it was the kind that contained a whole community's considered agreement. Della stood up at that dinner too. She had not planned to. She did not have a speech prepared, but she stood up when the formal speeches were done because there was something she wanted to say that she had not said in front of other people. She said, 7 years before many of you knew us as a couple, the sheriff paid a bill for me in Caldwell's store that I could not pay myself. He did it without a word, without calling attention to it, without asking for anything in return. I was too proud to thank him properly at the time. She paused. I have been thanking him properly every day since, and I intend to continue. There was laughter and applause, and Elijah, who was sitting beside her and who had the expression of a man who would very much prefer not to be the subject of public address, but who understood exactly why she was doing it, took her hand under the table. She sat down and he leaned close and said quietly, "You didn't have to do that." "I know," she said. "I wanted to." He pressed her hand once. Outside the hotel windows, Harlow's September evening was performing its customary miracle of light, the desert sky going orange and then deep rose and then the first cool violet of the coming dark, and the stars that would follow it were the same stars that had always been there, waiting patiently, bright and indifferent and beautiful. Inside the hotel, the people who had made a home in this particular piece of the Arizona territory were making noise and eating food and being, collectively, the specific and unrepeatable thing that a community was, people choosing to stay in the same place long enough to become part of its story. The Ellsworth story continued. It continued past the retirement dinner, and past the turn of the century, and into a new decade that brought changes to the territory that were significant, and some that were difficult, and some that were wonderful. It continued through Robert's young adulthood, when he went to study law at the University of Arizona and came back to Harlow and took a position at Hargreaves's firm, which had become Hargreaves and Son, and which was now Hargreaves, Son, and Ellsworth. It continued through Anna Margaret's marriage to a geologist named Parker who had come to the territory to survey copper deposits and had found, apparently, rather more than he was looking for. It continued through young James's decision to stay on the land operation and make it his own, which he did with his characteristic sunny competence, and to a degree of success that made Della's ledger columns very gratifying. She kept the ledger columns. She kept the tin on the kitchen shelf, though what was in it now was a different order of magnitude than the $23 that had felt like triumph in 1884. She kept the wardrobe from her mother's house, which occupied its corner of the bedroom and which her grandchildren, when they arrived, were fascinated by and allowed to explore with supervised curiosity. She kept the ring on her finger, the simple gold band with the turquoise stone, and she would keep it there until she died, which she had not yet done. She was 50 years old when Elijah retired from the sheriff's office, and she looked at him across the table on the morning after the dinner and thought about the hand reaching past her at the counter of Caldwell's, and about the coin package on the nightstand, and about the front steps on the October evening, and about all the mornings and evenings since then, stacked up into the particular architecture of a life they had built in a place they had both arrived at for reasons that seemed, in retrospect, to have been pointing them toward each other from the beginning. "What do you want to do?" she asked him, with the time. He considered this with his usual seriousness. "Read the books I haven't read yet," he said. "Help James with the operation in whatever way he'll accept. Spend more time sitting on the porch watching the evenings." He paused. "With you, specifically with you," she smiled. "That's a reasonable plan," she said. "It is," he agreed. He poured her coffee from the pot, because after 17 years of marriage he still poured her coffee first, which was such a small thing and such a consistent one that she had stopped noticing it for a while and then started noticing it again, and now she never missed it. "What do you want to do?" She thought about this. She thought about the sewing circle that was now the Harlow Women's Cooperative with 40 members and a building of its own. She thought about the land and the cattle and the ledger. She thought about Sophie Reyes, who ran the dressmaking work now with an expertise that had entirely superseded what she had learned from Della, which was exactly right. She thought about Anna Margaret and Robert and young James and the grandchildren who would come, who would grow up on this land that her father had bought with optimism and bad arithmetic, and which had become, against all the odds of drought and debt and loneliness and time, exactly what he had always said it would be. "More of this," she said simply. He looked at her over his coffee cup. "More of this," he agreed. Outside the windows of the Ellsworth kitchen, The Arizona Territory was doing what it always did in the early morning, being extraordinarily, unfairly beautiful in a way that demanded nothing and offered everything. The light coming up clean and cold from the east and turning the world gold for the space of an hour before the heat began to build. The cattle on the Southland were moving in their slow, companionable way between their water and their grazing. The ponderosa pines on the distant ridge were dark against the brightening sky. A hawk moved in a long arc over the open ground and then tipped and was gone. Della drank her coffee in the morning light and sat across from the man who had paid her grocery bill in Caldwell's general store with exact change and no explanation. The man who had loved her quietly and then loudly and consistently for all the years since. The man who was the reason she had a list of things she wanted more of that was too long to say aloud, and which she had no intention of stopping. The desert light continued its performance. The hawk found what it was looking for. The day began. She was not broke anymore. She had not been for a long time. But she thought sometimes, in the way you thought about the specific things that had made you what you were, about the dime on the counter and the silence after, and the hand reaching past her. And she was grateful for all of it. The hard parts and the gift that came disguised as small change and the long, improbable, beautiful life that had followed. The Arizona Territory would become a state in 1912, and the town of Harlow would still be there when it did, changed and grown and still fundamentally itself. The way places that have been loved by particular people retain something of that love in their architecture and their streets. The Ellsworth name would be on the town records for decades more, on the law firm and the land deed, and the minutes of the women's cooperative, and the school rolls where 3 generations of Ellsworth children appeared. But that was later. That morning in the year 1901, in the kitchen of a house on what the town had named Ellsworth Road, a woman named Della Wilcox Ellsworth sat across from her husband in the early light and was precisely, completely, irreversibly happy. And all the things that had led to this moment, the coins and the debt and the silences and the long, careful building of trust between two people who had both learned to be careful about trusting, were not wasted things, were not lost things, but were the very ground on which this had been built, specific and solid and all the way down.